Thanks, Bill. Really speaking, I've been invited down here today just to give you an insight into the situation in Northern Ireland. We do use different legislation, but I think it's timely given that it's the advent of new technical standards for yourselves to deal with in the south. So I'll take a look at some of the drivers for conservation of fuel and power, and my focus, as I say, will be on our regulation system in the north. But I'll provide a wee bit of a critical analysis of that system and maybe outline the benefits of the way we administer building regulations to aid compliance with conservation of fuel and power. The motivation behind our technical guidance in respect to conservation of fuel and power is that of climate change. Basically, if you wanted to think about your own technical standards as well, that they are the most effective tool at government's disposal to positively influence mitigation of carbon emissions from the built environment. The technical criteria we use are technical booklets F1 and F2 of the building regulations. I have taken the opportunity to take a look at your technical guidance document L, and basically it more or less replicates that. We both use whole building approaches and a calculation methodology to demonstrate compliance with the technical booklet. I set out a timeline for change, which basically our technical uplifts are fallen within. We are out of sync slightly. We still await our new 2010 document. It is 2012, but that will see a 25% improvement upon where we are today. Further improvement 2013, and then come 2016, we're looking at zero carbon for new build domestic accommodation. As mentioned, within domestic accommodation and also non-domestic accommodation, we do use the whole building approach, the exact same as yourselves. I did take a look in your technical booklet and see there seems to be a greater emphasis upon renewables than ourselves. We definitely focus upon energy conservation first, and then utilisation of renewables to try and provide energy for those areas which are outstanding whenever you maximise the benefits from energy efficiency. Now, where we hope to be in the future, well, these are the anticipated U values and let's say performance criteria for elements which influence energy use within domestic accommodation. So you can see, for example, come 2013, we are looking at more than likely mandatory use of mechanical ventilation heat recovery systems and air leakage values in the region of 3. Quite typically, I am seeing 10 within the north. In fact, I'd safely say most buildings that I would look at are achieving 7 with little or no problem. Now, you can see we have pretty robust technical guidance. We know where we want to go. It was basically early 2006 that this article was published within the Guardian newspaper. And this basically referred to the inspectors who looked the other way, basically my profession. It intimated that building control were not doing their job effectively when it came to specifically conservation of fuel and power. Now, I suppose this is a commercial newspaper interested in selling papers, and when has the truth ever stood in the way of a good story? So I found it pretty easy to dismiss that. However, there was publication of 3 major articles, or studies, I should say, either directly by the government or on behalf of the government. And the consensus within these documents was that building regulations were not effective in trying to reduce carbon emissions. Now, you might say, well, that's 2006, surely we've learned something. Well, I'll give you an actual example of a project which was conceived as an exemplar in respect of conservation of fuel and power. And This was to embody many of the anticipated changes within building regulations, which we would expect to see in 2013. It was also embracing the use of renewable technologies, solar, thermal, and heat pumps, and the air leakage value, which they hoped to achieve, was 3. I should say that development comprised of a number of domestic houses and flats. The actual, whenever it was constructed on site, was that the dwelling heat loss was in fact 54% greater than anticipated within the design calculations. And the carbon emissions from these exemplar buildings basically satisfy the criteria for actual building regulations now. And our standard, remember, is 2006. And the air leakage value, which was achieved, was typically 7 as opposed to the 3. So I provide that example to maybe further illustrate the point that non-compliance of building regulations is still occurring today. So, really speaking, it was in 2006 I was undertaking a Master's in Climate Change and Sustainable Development, and I was toying with the idea of what I should undertake as my dissertation subject. So, given the coverage of non-compliance with building regulations, I thought it was appropriate to investigate this a little further. One of the things I noted very early in the studies was that all the reference was drawn to the building regulation system within England and Wales, not Northern Ireland. Now that was quite significant because we actually have a different means to deliver building regulations. In England and Wales, they have approved inspectors, as we do in Northern Ireland. However, they have local authorities, as we do in Northern Ireland. But interestingly, they also have approved inspectors. Competition basically exists in England and Wales, whereas it doesn't in Northern Ireland. We work entirely within a monopoly environment. So, maybe if I come to the end of my findings, basically throughout analysis of information from questionnaires and actual site inspections, it was very apparent that non-compliance with conservation of fuel and power was not as high in Northern Ireland as it was in England and Wales. So I'll give you a brief overview of some of the major factors which contributed to our better compliance with conservation of fuel and power. Well, firstly, prioritisation. I think you have to recognise when it comes to prioritisation of conservation of fuel and power in the minds of building control surveyors, architects, developers and the public, it's nowhere near as high as I have illustrated fire safety and structure, basically health and safety matters which are within the building regulations. So right away in England and Wales, prioritisation of conservation of fuel and power was lower, and that also was replicated within Northern Ireland. You probably find that actually as you practice your own job. But 3 other factors which impacted upon the compliance levels with conservation of fuel and power included training. Basically, because of competition within England and Wales, training budgets are not as great within local authorities as they are within the north. We have a very training-focused regime. Not only do we provide training in respect to conservation of fuel and power to staff, we also provide it to architects and developers and to tradespeople on site. Within Belfast Building Control, we offer pre-submission consultation, and this is an opportunity for designers or developers to come to us prior to submitting their formal application and get an early indication as to what the contentious areas of their project might be. And we found that following our new regulations in 2006, more or less every consultation wanted to focus on conservation of fuel and power issues. With early indication as to what building control will be seeking, then I suppose designers could tailor the scheme to satisfy the requirements of the regulations. Finally then, site inspections. Basically, it was recognised within England and Wales that accredited details, which is a requirement within the document, were not being strictly followed on site. In Northern Ireland, it was slightly different. We did home in on matters which contributed to air infiltration and continuity of installation, basically because we had no prior experience within that area. However, these weren't sufficient enough to justify the reason why we were finding much higher compliance levels in Northern Ireland. The reality was the higher compliance levels we found were due to the delivery system of building regulations. In England and Wales, whenever you're working with an environment, the competition exists. Right away, building control are put in a position where at the outset of every scheme, they are effectively having to tender for offering the building control process to the developer. It's very hard to tender for that process when a couple of months previous you've taken enforcement action against areas of non-compliance in respect of any regulations, but specifically conservation of fuel and power. Do remember this, as said, people not only building control, but architects, developers, and the public generally don't see conservation of fuel and power in the same light as matters relating to, let's say, fire safety. We always find people tend to over-design when it comes to fire safety. The vast majority of applications which we receive, we struggle to get the minimum standard when it comes to conservation of fuel and power. Effectively, why we can take enforcement to the letter of the law in Belfast is Northern Ireland, is because we work within a monopoly environment. If we see an area of non-compliance, we have absolutely no hesitation in pointing that out and following it through until we get compliance. Now, that might seem like an awful culture to work within, but we also do try to align ourselves with the private sector, so we don't rule with an iron fist by any stretch of the imagination. Now, I just provide this slide because it's a bit of an endorsement of some of the things I see or I heard being mentioned earlier. I followed through and took a look at the actual areas of non-compliance within our technical guidance. And the major ones which came through, operation and maintenance manuals and air leakage. In some of the presentations earlier, I do remember people talking about the complexity of renewables. Basically, as buildings become more sophisticated, people do have to have a full working knowledge of how the building performs. And we found that this was an area of definite non-compliance within Belfast. And air leakage, I've heard plenty of people talking about how there are difficulties in respect of air leakage. In fact, I know there'll be further comment provided on that by some of the other speakers. Now, quickly, I suppose to conclude, this would maybe be something which yourselves want to take on board. Robust technical guidance does exist in the north and does exist now in the south. However, effective enforcement of regulations is required if that robust technical guidance is to be followed on site and deliver low energy buildings. I feel the Northern Ireland building regulation system does remove a lot of the potential barriers to aid compliance. Not all, but certainly ones which are otherwise presented in England and Wales. But it's not just building control which has to change to try and deliver on low carbon buildings. It's basically the entire industry. We do have a statutory duty and statutory powers, but we don't actively prosecute people. We tend to find that early engagement is a much better way to try and get to the same end goal of low energy buildings. And I did mention I have a Master's in Climate Change and Sustainable Development. The purpose of conservation of fuel and power and the building regulations is to mitigate the effects of climate change. Well, really speaking, I find it much easier to move away from speaking about conservation of fuel and power in the context of climate change, because how can you ever equate reduced amount of insulation within a floor slab to protection of the planet? I find it much easier to get my message across whenever I speak about conservation of fuel and power in terms of fuel poverty. Really speaking, I think it's important that we all get our message, let's say, politically relevant and relevant to the people who we have to engage with. Thanks very much for your time.